Game customization can be a great tool for tailoring an experience to your needs, but on occasion I feel like customization goes a little too far. Now, I'm not talking about character creators for RPGs and other types of games. Even in first-person games, having a character built to look like you, or however you want them to look, can be an enjoyable experience, even if you don't see your digital face all too often. So by all means, keep including a billion sliders that let me control every aspect of my character, including how low it hangs. I'm also not talking about accessibility options. Having menus for subtitles, text size, visibility, and a dozen other things is useful. Even as a fairly able-bodied person, I find that some developers lean their default text sizes to pretty small margins, or don't consider how their non-outline subtitles read against bright backgrounds. So please, keep adding these features so people less able than me can continue to enjoy games, and I can reap the benefits as my body crosses over into my next decade. No, what I'm talking about is when games add in customization options that seem almost counter to their designs. My first, smaller example is Mario Kart 8. I guess it's already hot take time, but I don't like custom karts. And I kind of hope the new game scraps the idea. On its surface, kart customization is a logical extension of the direction Mario Kart was going in. Different characters had different stats, and eventually they gained access to different vehicles with further stat variations. It's a logical leap forward to break down the vehicles into body, wheels, and glider, giving you further control over your stat spread. My problem here is that I think it's too many choices for what is supposed to be a pick-up-and-play kart racer. I've got 30-something characters to choose from, and then I get another menu of 3 scroll wheels filled with dozens of vehicle parts, sometimes with minute stat differences between one another. My reward for continued play is more parts, meaning I have to check whether the new one fits my preferred spread, or scroll all the way back to my original loadout. It feels slow and agonizing waiting for other players to pick their loadouts in local multiplayer, especially because it gets harder to read in 4-player split screen. What's more, loadouts are saved to player slots, not characters. If at any point I want to switch characters, I have to spend more time scrolling through the menu to find a preferred loadout. On its surface though, I think Mario Kart 8's customization is salvageable. For me, it gets in the way of a lot of the pick-up-and-play nature of the game, but this could be easily solved if we just put custom karts in their own menu. Let's take a page from Smash Ultimate with the Mii fighters. If I select the Mii characters on the screen, I'm not asked to create my custom loadout right before the match. I simply choose from the ones I've already made. If I want to build a new Mii fighter, I do this in its own menu outside of my free-for-all games. There's no waiting around for a friend to finish their Mii build while everyone's already selected their character. If the next Mario Kart wanted to keep custom karts, I think this is the solution. Provide a few pre-made karts to make it faster to start a multiplayer match, and build out a separate menu for combining vehicle parts. That way, after I've played single player or online by myself for a while and unlocked new parts, I can spend my own time building custom karts. We can keep the complexity, choice, and competitive mechanics of custom karts without sacrificing the ease of starting a multiplayer match from older titles. And at that point, I won't feel like custom vehicles ballooned into this annoying, overly complex choice that I'm forced to wade through every time I want to play the game. My next example, though, I don't feel can be solved through simply changing the context. I think it's bad that Sonic Frontiers lets you customize your physics sliders. I'm sorry, but in a platformer where your challenges are designed around character movement, it's really bad to let players just change all those values. When there's a spectrum of movement values for basically everything defining your physics from ground acceleration to starting speed, this presents a huge problem. Now you don't just have to account for a range of player skill, but also a range of character controllers. Some challenges that would be easy on the default or recommended layout may just end up being difficult or even impossible if the player prefers something like a low acceleration, low starting speed, low boost strength build. So, to compensate, you have to either make your platforms really wide and blocky to catch as many players as possible, or design challenges that don't use the player's control settings. And the designers did both. Platforms in the overworld are really wide, and certain challenges use mechanics that function agnostic to your settings. When the game launched, cyberspace originally ignored your settings completely, probably in part because the reused level design segments were designed with specific character controllers in mind. Even now, both the rail and air boosts ignore all of your settings and push you to top speed. Clearly, even in the overworld, the adjustable character controller was going to cause problems if those choices weren't taken away. When Sonic Frontiers greeted me with the full menu of movement sliders, my thought wasn't, "Wow, I love all these sliders." Instead, I grew frustrated with even attempting to tune the movement. Adjusting a slider would sometimes create differences so minute that I was sure I imagined them. It didn't feel like I was given a wealth of gameplay styles or accessibility options. This isn't selecting from different characters or being able to adjust game speed to accommodate my reaction time. No, it felt more like I was being asked to do the job of finishing the character controller myself. I'm not going to do the hack YouTuber thing and call the developers lazy. What likely happened here is a convergence of a few issues. Firstly, Frontiers probably needed more development time. There are other parts of the game that also feel scattered or somewhat unfinished, so there's probably a degree of "it's good enough" that went into certain decisions. This is the unfortunate reality of game development for a lot of series and studios. Secondly, taking Sonic in a new, open zone direction probably sparked some contentious debate at the studio about how Sonic's controls needed to change. The final design leans pretty close to what other people would describe as boost gameplay, albeit with some changes to abilities, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were conversations about radically changing Sonic's moveset. Couple that with the fact that, in general, the Sonic fanbase has wildly conflicting ideas about what ideal Sonic control is, and, well, I wouldn't be surprised if nailing down the character controller became somewhat of an insurmountable task. It really does feel like a decision made up against a deadline. We're taking Sonic in a new gameplay direction, and we don't know if players will appreciate radical changes to movement alongside this new combat focus. We've already got a set deadline, and we need to make sure enough resources go into the new features, so let's keep the movement close to previous games and add in an options menu to tweak the character controller. Maybe we can gather some player data to see how we should tune this in future installments. Through this lens, at least, it's a sound choice. Unfortunately, I don't think it makes for a graceful execution. Like I said, this menu represents choice paralysis more than it does freedom, and from my perspective, it hampers how finely tuned level design can be. Wide movement spectrums means wide platforms. As I described before, I don't think this is an easy fix, and in fact the solution I'm about to propose may have been something the developers already had considered, but deemed not possible due to development conditions of which I have no knowledge. But how would I, the backseat designer, solve this issue? For Frontiers specifically, I think the game would have been better served with radically different character physics. Sonic's boost style of gameplay serves him well in tighter roller coaster levels like Generations and Unleashed. I'm not going to get into the debate of linearity and automation, but I think open zone necessitates wider area design than boost gameplay is really made for. Ideally, Sonic's character controller would have leaned closer to the Genesis titles, or maybe even Adventure 1, with the idea being that Sonic relies more on the environment to build up speed rather than getting instant boosts from dash panels and his own boost meter. However, this kind of radical gameplay shift probably wasn't possible, especially with cyberspace leaning so heavily on older level designs. Sticking to the familiar was almost certainly done so that more resources could be dedicated to the open areas and tuning the new mechanics. So in this case, and just generally for these kinds of platforming games, the solution would be to just choose the values you're setting for the character controller. While I understand where the decision may have come from, I think ultimately exposing all those variables only served to hamper the gameplay experience. I genuinely enjoy a lot of what Frontiers has to offer, but these sliders are just too much. Having Sonic with a consistent character controller would have given more room to tighten level designs in the open zone. And if there really was a question of how those variables needed to be tuned, perhaps it would have been a good opportunity to add in other characters. We eventually got Tails, Amy, and Knuckles in the Final Horizon update, but perhaps a different direction was in order. There does seem to be some uncertainty as to how Boost Sonic gameplay needed to be tweaked in order to accommodate the new format, so maybe this would have been the appropriate time to include characters who historically play very similar to modern Sonic. Perhaps Sonic would be the speed-oriented build, Shadow would be slower and more reliant on acceleration and combat power, and Blaze could be included as a sort of middle ground between the two. In this way, rather than having a full menu of dials and knobs to adjust, the player just has 3 characters they can freely swap between. It also narrows down any metrics you might be gathering data on. Rather than sifting through what values were on what sliders, you could simply see which characters people gravitated towards. Mind you, this isn't a simple solution either. While giving Sonic set values on his character controller would have been, at least in my opinion, a better direction, launching with 2 other characters would have been risky, and it also means 2 other characters the development team needs to make sure won't break during testing of the base game. It likely wouldn't have been just a model and animation swap, and even that scope of work is rarely as simple as some would have you believe. So, what is the lesson in all this? Well, firstly, as we see in Mario Kart, it's important to think about the context in which customization appears. A big wheel of options right at the start of a casual multiplayer game can leave a more negative impression than is intended. And so sometimes we need to put things in menus that are separate but still easily visible to the player. In the case of games like Sonic Frontiers, it's also important to ask if the customization is really necessary, and how that customization affects the rest of the game's design. The wide swath of options available to you is potentially part of why so many people find Pokemon games to be so easy. The designers have an idea of what team you should build, but when you have something like 300 guys to choose team members from, it's hard to build a progression path that accounts for all variables. Narrowing options allows a designer to hone in the challenge, and so conversely, more options means needing to cast a wider net. This is something I have to account for in my own game design. With my tabletop game, I know what an optimal choice looks like, but my students don't always choose the right attacks or buy the right gear. With that said, that's all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll watch again in the next video.